At 5:10 on a Thursday morning in October, the dispatcher at the Paducah City Dock called my landline and said there was a woman down on the ramp asking for Judah Sackett, and that she said she was my daughter. My daughter walked out of my house in October of 2006, and the last time anybody could put her anywhere for certain was a shelter intake in Tulsa in 2008. And that is 19 years. I put my boots on in the dark and drove down Broadway with the river fog coming up over the flood wall. And I want to be honest that for about 4 minutes on that drive, I let myself believe it. Then I came down the ramp and she turned around under the light, and she had my wife's chin and Verity's scar on her left shin. And she said, "Daddy." And I stopped walking. Because my daughter never called me Daddy in her life. She called me Cap from the time she was 6 years old, because that is what the deckhands called me, and she thought it was the funniest thing she had ever heard. And she never once called me anything else, not in a fight, and not in a card, and not on the night she left. My name is Judah Sackett. I am 72 years old. Before I tell you who that woman actually was, tell me in the comments where you are watching from tonight and what the weather is doing there. And hit like and subscribe if somebody has ever handed you back exactly what you wanted, and you knew right away it was wrong. One honest note before we begin. This story is a work of fiction. The voice you are hearing and the images you are seeing are AI-assisted. Names, places, and events are invented for storytelling. Any resemblance to real people is purely coincidental. But the lessons about family, greed, and quiet strength are very real. Now, let us begin. I was a pilot on the Ohio and the Lower Mississippi for 34 years, and then I taught at the pilot school over in Cape Girardeau for another 12. And if you want to understand everything that happened in the last year of my life, you have to understand what that trade actually is. People think a pilot steers. Steering is nothing. What a pilot does is read a surface. You are looking at a mile of brown water that appears to be perfectly flat and featureless. And out of that, you have to know that there is a wing dam 11 feet down at the third wrinkle from the point, and that the boil 40 yards off your bow means the bottom just came up, and that the seam where two currents meet is telling you the truth about a bar that has moved 300 feet since June. Everything that matters is under the surface, and the surface will tell you all of it if you have spent enough years learning to be told. I did that for 46 years, and then a woman came up a boat ramp in the dark and said one word wrong, and I knew. And I still put her in my truck and drove her to my house. Because that is the other thing about reading a surface, which is that knowing what is under there does not mean you turn the boat. Verity was born in June of 1987, and she grew up on the water the way you do in a family that has been on it 4 generations. She was on a deck at 8. She could tie a bowline behind her back at 10. She had a 2-tone whistle, low, then high, that I taught her for calling across a tow when the engines are up and nobody can hear a voice. And she used it her whole childhood, in the house, in the grocery store, at her grandmother's funeral, and it drove her mother out of her mind. And on her left shin there was a scar about 2 inches long from a cleat on the Nell Marie when she was 11, ragged at both ends, gone white by the time she was 20. In October of 2006, when she was 19, she came into the galley of a boat I was running out of Mound City and told me she was quitting the river and going to art school in Kansas City. And I said the sentence I have thought about every single day for 19 years. And I am going to say it out loud here because I have never once said it out loud to anybody. I said, "Then you are not a Sackett. You are just a girl with a suitcase." She looked at me for a second, and she did not cry, and she did not shout. And she got off at Cairo, and she went home and packed, and she was gone before I got back. And then I waited. That is the part I cannot get around. I did not look for her for 2 years because I had decided that she was going to come back and apologize, and I had decided that the day she did, I would be big about it. I told my wife it was a phase. I told myself that a girl with no money and no trade comes home by Christmas. She did not come home by Christmas. In 2008, a caseworker at a shelter in Tulsa returned a call and confirmed she had been there. And after that, there was nothing at all. 19 years of nothing. And by then, my pride had a 19-year head start on my sense. Nell died in the spring of 2022, 44 years married. She kept the books for the Harbor Service, and she was the only person on this earth who was never once afraid of me. And after she went, the house on Jefferson got very large, and I stopped going into 2 of the rooms. My son Cormac took over Sackett Harbor Service 11 years ago, fleeting and shifting barges in the Paducah Harbor, 6 boats and about 30 people. And he is 44, and he has never in his life asked me a question about the river that he could have asked somebody else instead. So, that is the man who came down the ramp at 5:10 in October. A widower with a dead marriage's worth of quiet in his house and a daughter-shaped hole in him 19 years wide. And anybody looking at that from the outside would have said he was the easiest mark in western Kentucky. She was 38, or near it, thin, dark-haired, with a canvas bag and a coat that was wrong for the weather. Under that dock light, she was very good. She had the chin. She had the set of the shoulders. And when she pulled her sock down and showed me the scar on her left shin, I got down on one knee on wet concrete at 72 years old to look at it. And it was in the right place and the right length, and it was pink, and the edges of it were clean and even, the way a line is clean when somebody drew it on purpose. A cleat tear on an 11-year-old goes white, and it goes ragged, because a cleat does not cut, it tears. That scar was 2 years old at the outside, and it had been made by somebody with a scalpel and a photograph. I looked at it for about 6 seconds, and then I said, "All right." And I stood up, and I put my hand out for her bag. And that was the moment I decided to let the whole thing come into my house, because the only question I actually cared about was not who she was. It was who sent her. I have thought about whether that was the right call. Any sensible man calls the police at 5:10 and lets somebody else sort it. But I was a pilot for 34 years, and if you see a boil off the bow, the wrong move is to jam the rudder, because then you find out what the bottom is doing by hitting it. What you do is hold your line and watch it develop, and let the river tell you the rest. She came up the outside stairs at the house in front of me, and she went up facing forward with her hand out for the wall. Verity came up steel stairs sideways with a hand on the rail, like every single person who has ever spent a childhood on a boat. And you do not lose that. You could not lose that if you tried. 2 tells inside of 20 minutes. My son and his wife were at my kitchen door by 7:40. Cormac had a coat on over a t-shirt, and he came through that door saying, "Dad, is it true? Is it her?" before he had his second foot in the house, and Delia came in behind him with her hair done. I have been coming to grips with that detail ever since. It was 7:40 in the morning, in an emergency, and my daughter-in-law's hair was done. Which means she had been up and getting ready before that phone call could possibly have reached them. They fell all over her. Cormac had his arms around that woman for a long time, and he cried. And I want to say plainly that I believe those were real tears, though not for the reason anybody in that kitchen was meant to think. Delia held both her hands and said, "We never stopped. We never once stopped." And the woman said the right things back in the right order. I made breakfast. I have thought about how strange it is that when a man decides to run a test on somebody, he starts cooking. But that is what I did. Eggs and scrapple and coffee. and while I was standing at the stove with my back to that table, I put 2 fingers in my mouth and blew Verity's whistle. Low, then high, the way I had done 10,000 times in that kitchen to call a girl down out of her room. Nobody at that table moved. Cormac said, "Dad, what are you doing?" And the woman looked at me with a polite and pleasant expression, waiting, the way you wait when somebody has done something eccentric and you are being nice about it. My daughter would have had that whistle back at me before I finished it. It was not a memory for her, it was a reflex. And reflexes are the one thing you cannot teach a person out of a notebook. Over the next 4 days, I ran maybe 9 of those, and she failed 6 and passed 3. And the 3 she passed were all things that could be found. She knew the deckhands' names. She knew what was painted on the stern of the Nell Marie. She knew about the summer the towboat lost a rudder off Cave-in Rock. All of that is in photographs and stories, and in the sort of thing a family repeats at Thanksgiving for 20 years. What she could not do was correct me. On the second evening, I sat on the porch with her, and I pointed downriver and said something about coming under the Brookport Bridge in high water. Except the bridge I described was the Irvin Cobb, and I described it wrong on purpose. And my daughter had corrected me about those 2 bridges since she was 9 years old, aggressively, with her whole face, because being right about the river in front of her father was the great project of her childhood. This woman said, "I remember that. Real people correct you about the thing they have always corrected you about. That is not memory. That is who they are." The papers came on the 5th day. Cormac brought a lawyer out of Nashville to my kitchen table with a folder, and the whole shape of it was in front of me in about 90 seconds. When Nell died, she left 49% of Sackett Harbor Service and her half of the house to Verity. And because Verity could not be found, it went into a trust with a bank in Louisville as trustee. And the terms are what the terms are. If Verity is declared legally dead, all of it comes to me. Not to Cormac, to me. And I am 72 with a bad valve, and my will has been the same since 2009, and my son has read it. But a living Verity can sign. A living Verity can walk into a bank in Louisville with identification and instruct the trustee and assign her interest to whoever she likes, and it is done in an afternoon, and there is no probate and no court and nobody to contest it. That is the whole reason for the surgery on that shin. Cormac did not need a dead sister. He needed a signing one. Sackett Harbor Service has been losing money for 4 years. I did not know that. I sold him my 60% of the operating company in 2017 on a note, and I stopped going down to the office because he asked me to, and he asked me in a way that I understood, and I respected it. And that was a mistake. In August of last year, he pledged 3 of the 6 boats to a fleet lender out of Memphis on terms that no man signs unless he is out of moves. And this coming March, there is a balloon on that note of $1,100,000. I called Otho Reddick on the 6th day. Otho is 78. He piloted the lower river for 40 years, and he was in my wedding. And he came over and sat on my porch and drank a beer and talked to that woman for an hour. And he did it the way an old man talks, wandering, harmless. And somewhere in the middle of it, he asked her whether she remembered running the Owensboro turn with her daddy in a fog, and she said she did, and she described it, and she described it beautifully. And she described it going the wrong way around a bar that has not been on that side of the channel since before she was born. Otho put his beer down on the rail and looked out at the water for a while. Then he came in the kitchen where I was, and he said, "Judah." And I said, "I know." And he said, "Does she know you know?" And I said, "No, and I would like to keep it that way for about 2 more weeks." Here is the thing I did next, and it is the one thing in all of this I am proud of. I did not confront anybody. I called a lawyer of my own, a woman named Cleota Rand in Paducah, and then I got the DNA. That part was easy, and it was small, and it was sad. She used a green cup at my table for 4 days. On the 6th night after she went up to bed, I put that cup in a paper sack with a glove on, and I bagged the brush out of the hall bathroom, and I drove them to a place in Nashville that Cleota's office uses, and I paid cash, and I signed the chain of custody form myself in front of the intake clerk. It took 9 days. When Cleota called, she asked me to come to her office rather than tell me over the phone, and I knew from that what the first half of it was. 0 markers consistent with a parent and child. Not a daughter, not a niece, not a cousin, not a distant anything. A complete stranger sitting in my dead wife's kitchen wearing a scar she had cut into her own leg. But Cleota had done something I had not asked her to do, and it is the reason this story is not just about a fraud. She had put the profile through a public genealogy database, the Ancestry kind, the ones that people load their own results into. And it came back with a name in about 4 hours, because the woman had a first cousin in Sapulpa, Oklahoma, who had spit in a tube in 2019 for a Christmas present. Her name is Shiloh Bream. She is 39 years old. She was born in Sapulpa and raised mostly in state care, and she has a record that is 9 pages long, and every single entry on it is the kind of thing poor people get charged with. Bad checks, trespass, 2 possessions. Nothing violent, ever, in 22 years. And then Cleota turned the page and read me the thing that took the floor out from under me, which is that Shiloh Bream had an intake record at the Cimarron Women's Center in Tulsa, Oklahoma, dated the 9th of January, 2008, which is the same shelter in the same city in the same winter as the last confirmed sighting of my daughter. They were roommates for 14 months. I sat in that office and could not get any air, because you understand what that means. Every single thing that woman knew about my family, she did not learn out of a notebook. She learned it out of my daughter's mouth, on a cot in a room in Tulsa in the 2008 and 2009 that I spent in Paducah waiting for an apology. She knew the whistle. She got the whistle wrong because Verity had described it and not performed it. She knew the scar because Verity had shown it to her 100 times in 14 months of sharing a bathroom. She called me Daddy because that is the word a woman who never had one reaches for. And she failed the bridge, and she failed the Owensboro turn because Verity, who told her everything, apparently never once told her the thing she was proudest of, which was that she could outpilot her father from memory at the age of 14. I asked Cleota where Verity was. Cleota said, "Judah, I do not know, and that is a different question, and we are going to have to be careful about the order we do things in." We did it in the right order. On the 28th of November, with 2 detectives from the Paducah police in my front room and Cleota beside me, I came down my own stairs at 7 in the morning and I said, "Sit down, Shiloh." And I have never seen a human face do what that face did. She did not run, and she did not deny it. She sat down on my wife's couch and she put both hands flat on her knees and she looked at the floor and she said, "I am not going to say anything until you know that I tried to find you first." They arrested Cormac at the harbor office at 9:40 that same morning, and Delia at their house on Lone Oak Road. And the lawyer from Nashville surrendered his license in February rather than be disbarred over it. But that is the small part of this. The part that matters happened over the next 11 days, and it came out of 2 places, and neither one of them was a courtroom. The first was a bank box in Louisville that my son had been paying $11 a month on for 3 years. Inside it were 4 letters. 2 of them were written by my daughter in her handwriting, which I would know at the bottom of the ocean. One postmarked Tulsa in March of 2008, and one postmarked Joplin, Missouri in January of 2009. Both of them were addressed to my wife at the house on Jefferson Street. Both of them had been open. The third was a copy Nell had made of her own reply. And the fourth was a letter my wife wrote in 2016, sealed, addressed to me, and never sent. I am going to tell you what was in them, because there is no version of this story that means anything without it. Verity wrote to her mother 11 months after she left, and she wrote to her mother and not to me. And the first line of the first letter is, "Do not tell Cap, and if you tell Cap, I will not write again." And Nell wrote back, and Verity wrote again, and for 11 months, from March of 2008 until February of 2009, my wife had a correspondence with our daughter and sent her money 4 times out of the grocery account and never said one word to me about any of it. In every letter, Verity asked the same question in some form. She asked whether I had softened. In the last one, she asked it plainly. She wrote, "Has he said anything about me? Does he say my name? And if I came up the walk, would he open the door? Or would he wait for me to say I was wrong first?" And my wife, who did not lie, wrote back the truth, which was, "Not yet." Nell's unsent letter to me is 2 pages, and it was written 6 years after our daughter's last letter and 6 years before Nell died. She wrote that she kept the promise because it was the only condition on which she got to have her daughter at all, and that she would keep it again, and that she was not asking me to forgive it. And then she wrote the 2 sentences that I have on a piece of paper in my shirt pocket right now. She wrote, "Judah, our girl was alive for 3 years after she walked out of here, and she was writing to me, and every single time she was asking whether you were ready yet." And she wrote, "I have never been able to work out which of us she was waiting on, and I think it was both. And I think we both made her wait too long." The second place was Shiloh Bream, who told the whole thing to a detective in an interview room in December, with her own attorney telling her to stop, and who told it knowing perfectly well it did not help her one bit, because there was no charge anywhere in it, and no leniency in it, and nothing in it for her at all. Verity died on the 4th of March 2009 in a motel on the west side of Joplin, Missouri, of an overdose at 21 years old. Shiloh was in the room. She was 19 feet away and asleep, and she woke up at about 4 in the morning and could not get her up. And she called the ambulance from the office phone, and they worked on her for a long time, and it did not matter. And then Shiloh Bream, who was 22 and had $11 and a warrant in another county, did what a person in that position does, which is that she was gone before the police came. My daughter had been going by a name that was not hers for 2 years because of the same warrant business, and there was nothing in that room with a real name on it. She went into the Newton County records as an unidentified female, approximate age 20, and 11 months later, she was buried in the county section of a cemetery outside Neosho, Missouri, under a flat concrete marker with a number stamped in it. Shiloh tried to find us. That is the part I asked her about myself, later, in a room, with permission. She said she had a first name, Verity, which she assumed was made up because who is named that? And she had a river, and she had the word Cap, and she had a state. She said she went to a library in 2011 and typed things into a computer for 3 hours and did not know what she was doing and got nowhere and never tried again. And she said, "Mr. Sackett, I was 24 and I did not have a car." 16 years later, my son found her. He found her because he went through his mother's papers in the summer of 2022 after the funeral, and he found those letters in a shoebox. And one of them had a return address in Tulsa on the back flap. And my son, who had in his hand the first hard information about his sister in 14 years, did not bring it to me. He took it to Tulsa, and he ran it down, and he found a woman who had known her, and he sat across a table from the one person alive who could tell his father where his daughter was buried. And what he saw was a resemblance and an opportunity. He never asked her where Verity was. She told the detective that in December, and I have not been able to put it down since. In 7 months of meetings and coaching and paying for a surgery on her leg, my son never once asked that woman what happened to his sister. We got her out of the ground on the 2nd of April. The Newton County Coroner's Office was decent about it beyond anything I had a right to expect. The dental comparison came back in 9 days off records from a dentist on Park Avenue in Paducah who kept his files in a basement for 30 years because he never got around to throwing anything out. My daughter came home to Kentucky on a Tuesday in May, and we put her next to her mother. Cormac took 12 years in April on the conspiracy and the identity fraud and the exploitation counts, and Delia took 5. I did not go to the sentencing. He has written twice. I have not opened either one. And I will tell you honestly that this is not strength. It is that I do not yet know which man is going to be reading it when I do. Shiloh Bream pleaded to conspiracy and identity fraud, and she is doing 4 years at the women's facility in Pewee Valley. Before the sentencing, her lawyer asked whether I would give a statement, and Cleota advised me not to, and I gave one anyway. I told that court that she came into my house to rob me, and that she cut her own leg open to do it, and that all of that is true, and she should be sentenced for it. And then I told them that she was the only human being in the world who sat in a room with my daughter for 14 months, and that she was the last one to see her alive, and that she gave me all of it for nothing when it could only cost her. I asked for the low end. She got the low end. I drive to Pewee Valley about every 6 weeks. I am 72 years old, and I do not have a word for what she is to me, and I have stopped trying to find one. She tells me things. She told me Verity worked 11 months at a diner in Tulsa and was good at it. She told me Verity drew on everything, receipts, napkins, the backs of intake forms, and that she drew boats constantly, and that when Shiloh asked her once why she did not go home if she loved it that much, my daughter said, "Because he is not done being right yet." She told me the last thing she remembers Verity saying on the 3rd of March, which was about a job in Springfield she was going to go look at. The stone we put up says Verity Nell Sackett, and it has the dates, and under the dates I had them cut a line that Otho Reddick argued with me about for a week. It says, "She could read the river." It is the only true thing I could think of to say about her that was hers and not mine. This is a work of fiction, and the voice you have been listening to is not a living man. But the lesson under it is as real as brown water and cold stone. I spent 46 years teaching men that the surface tells you everything if you will let it. A boil means the bottom came up. A seam means 2 things are meeting under there. And the one rule I gave every cadet who ever came through that school was that the river does not owe you a second look. So take the first one seriously. And then I went home and got a phone call in 1980-something from a 19-year-old girl who told me she wanted to draw. And I read it as an insult to 4 generations, and I did not look twice. And I let a piece of pride sit in the middle of my family for 19 years like a wing dam nobody marked. So when somebody you love tells you who they are, believe the first telling. And do not spend one single day waiting for a person to come back and admit you were right, because they may be a great deal further away than you think. And the waiting is not neutral, and it does not preserve anything. It buries somebody. My name is Judah Sackett, and they buried the wrong man.